My chisel traced the hairline fracture on the porcelain teacup, a delicate, almost invisible spiderweb marring an otherwise perfect heirloom. The light from my workbench lamp cast a sharp, unforgiving glow, highlighting every microscopic imperfection. Precision, I always told myself, was not just a skill, it was a devotion. Each piece I restored wasn't just mended, it was understood, its history whispered back into existence through my careful hands. I had spent years cultivating this quiet, solitary life, finding solace in the tangible stories held within aged wood and tarnished silver. My days were a predictable rhythm of solvents, fine brushes, and the hushed symphony of my own breath. This rhythm, however, had been violently disrupted 3 weeks ago by a stiff, official letter. An inheritance. A manor house, tucked away in some forgotten corner of the countryside. My great-aunt, a woman I'd met twice in my life, had apparently left me everything. Everything turned out to be a sprawling, crumbling monument to neglect. The drive had been interminable. The asphalt gave way to cracked gravel, then to a barely discernible track swallowed by overgrown weeds. The further I drove, the more the world seemed to recede, the signal on my phone dying a slow, agonizing death until it was nothing but a hollow icon. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old pennies left out in the rain. Then, through a break in the ancient, skeletal trees, it appeared. It wasn't a house, it was a presence. A hulking, stone behemoth, gray and forbidding, like a permanent bruise on the landscape. The roof sagged in places, a tired spine giving way to the weight of centuries. Vines, thick as my arm, clawed their way up the crumbling walls, a verdant shroud trying to reclaim what man had built. A rusted iron gate, half off its hinges, groaned a welcome, or perhaps a warning, as I pushed it open. I cut the engine of my old utility vehicle. The sudden silence was deafening, a physical pressure against my eardrums. I could hear my own heart thudding a slow, anxious rhythm. This was it. My inheritance. It felt less like a gift and more like a burden, an obligation laid upon me by a ghost. A faint breeze rustled through the skeletal trees, carrying with it a faint, sweet smell, like decaying flowers and something else. Something deeper, more earthy, like disturbed soil. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. The front door, a massive slab of weathered oak, was secured with a padlock the size of my fist, thick with rust. I fumbled with the key, a heavy, ornate thing that felt ancient in my palm. Pushing the door open was a struggle. It scraped against the floorboards, protesting its long slumber. A cloud of dust billowed out, carrying with it the scent of stagnation, old wood, damp plaster, and a pervasive, cloying sweetness I couldn't quite place. It reminded me, strangely, of the faint, musty aroma of forgotten manuscripts in the prison library after hours, when I used to spend entire nights hunched over obscure texts, tracing the genealogy of furniture makers. But this was different. Heavier. More alive. I stepped inside. The entryway was a cavernous space, swallowed by gloom. Tall, arched windows were obscured by layers of grime and heavy, velvet drapes that hung in tattered strips, like forgotten mourning clothes. The air was frigid, despite the lack of obvious drafts. My breath plumed in front of me. My eyes slowly adjusted. Ornate wallpaper, once vibrant, now peeled in curling strips, revealing patches of damp, discolored plaster beneath. A broken grandfather clock stood sentinel in a corner, its pendulum frozen in time, its face cracked like a shattered porcelain plate. The silence was profound, broken only by the drip of water somewhere in the distance, a relentless, maddening rhythm. I walked further in, my boots echoing loudly on the bare, dust-laden floorboards. Each step felt like an intrusion, a desecration. A strange impulse, a flicker of something akin to curiosity, began to stir within me, pushing past the initial unease. This place was a puzzle, a vast, complex mechanism seized by time. And I, Reed, the meticulous restorer, was now its reluctant custodian. The thought, though daunting, was also a challenge. I felt a prickle of determination. I would bring this place back. I would understand its secrets. I had no idea then, of course, that the secrets it held were not just architectural, but something far more insidious, something that would begin to unravel the very fabric of who I was. It was well past midnight, the only other soul in the building being the night custodian, whose heavy-footed patrols echoed faintly from distant corridors. Here, amidst the stale scent of aging paper and forgotten knowledge, I sought answers that the manor itself stubbornly withheld. My meticulous nature, usually applied to the delicate curve of a salvaged baluster or the intricate grain of a forgotten desk, was now focused on dusty microfiches and brittle parish records. I'd been tracing the property's lineage, sifting through deeds and wills, trying to understand the blank pages in its documented history. There were gaps, strange ellipses where entire generations seemed to vanish, only to reappear a century later with a new name attached to the estate. It was like trying to restore a painting with crucial sections simply scraped away. Tonight, my focus was on a particular period, the late 17th century, when the manor had undergone a significant, almost secretive, architectural change. The records were sparse, almost deliberately so, as if someone had gone to great lengths to erase the details. A stack of local almanacs, brittle and foxed, lay beside me, their pages whispering complaints as I carefully turned them. My magnifying glass glinted under the harsh light, a beacon in the dim, cavernous room. I was looking for any mention of the manor, any local gossip or obscure builder's notes. My fingers, usually nimble with a chisel, felt clumsy sifting through the fine print. That's when it started. I just placed a heavy, leather-bound volume, a compendium of local lore, back on its shelf, its spine groaning softly. I turned to retrieve another, a slim pamphlet on regional architecture. When I glanced back, the compendium was no longer flush with its neighbors. It jutted out by a good inch, casting a disproportionate shadow. I paused, my brow furrowing. I was certain I'd pushed it all the way in. Fatigue, I reasoned, was playing tricks. I leaned over, pushed it firmly back into place, and then deliberately ran my hand along the row to ensure everything was aligned. Satisfied, I returned to my table. Minutes later, a soft, dry rustle came from the shelves behind me. It wasn't the sound of paper, but something deeper, like a heavy coat dragging across stone. I froze, my hand hovering over a page of meticulous script. I listened, my breath held. Nothing. Only the persistent hum of the lights and the distant, rhythmic thud of the custodian's steps. It had to be the air conditioning system, I decided, or the settling of the old building. These places, even modern ones, had their creaks and groans. I tried to refocus, but the thread of concentration had snapped. I pulled my sweater tighter. Then, a faint scratching sound emanated from the row of shelves I had just been working on. It was delicate, insistent, like fingernails lightly tracing an old wooden surface. I turned slowly, my chair scraping against the linoleum floor. My gaze swept across the spines, the orderly rows of knowledge. Nothing was out of place. Only the hum responded. My logical mind, my restorer's mind, demanded an explanation. A mouse? A loose floorboard? The custodian, perhaps, checking on me? But the scratching had been too precise, too deliberate. It had felt like it was for me. I stood up and walked silently towards the shelves. I ran my hand along the wooden shelves, feeling the smooth, worn surface. No vibrations, no loose panels. My fingers brushed against the very book I'd seen jutting out earlier, a compendium of local lore. It was still perfectly aligned. I pulled it out, its weight familiar in my hands. I flipped through its pages, looking for anything, a loose leaf, a trapped insect. As I was about to reshelve it, my gaze snagged on a small, almost imperceptible detail on the binding. Etched into the leather, barely visible unless the light caught it just right, was a symbol. It wasn't part of the title or the publisher's mark. It was a crude, almost childish drawing, a spiral, but not a perfect one. It was broken, disjointed, as if the artist had run out of space or forgotten how to finish it. I'd seen something similar before, hadn't I? A faint, almost erased carving in one of the manor's oldest foundation stones. I dismissed it as weathering. I pulled out my phone and quickly snapped a photo. My fingers trembled slightly. I packed up my research, the strange spiral symbol burning itself into my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had deliberately drawn my attention to that book, to that symbol. As I walked out, past the rows of silent, watchful books, I felt the phantom weight of unseen eyes following my every step. And I had a terrible feeling I knew exactly what it wanted. It was well past midnight, the only other soul in the building being the night custodian, whose heavy-footed patrols echoed faintly from distant wings, a rhythmic thud against the pervasive silence. My hands, still grimy from a day spent wrestling with a stubborn lead pipe in the manor's west wing, felt out of place amidst the crisp paper and dusty bindings. But this was my new ritual, fix by day, research by night. The manor had secrets, and I intended to unearth every last one. I'd been sifting through regional historical society archives for weeks, cross-referencing property deeds, census records, and old newspaper clippings. My focus tonight was on the local families who had owned the manor before my distant relative, the one who'd left me this dubious inheritance. There were gaps, strange lacunae in the official records that gnawed at me. Names would appear, then vanish, with no clear explanation of sale or transfer. My fingers, calloused from years of restoring delicate antiques, traced the spines of a rarely touched section marked local peculiarities, unfiled manuscripts. The librarian, a stoic woman with spectacles perched on her nose, had pointed me to it with a dismissive wave, saying, "Just old junk no one's digitized." Probably ramblings. To me, ramblings often held the most truth. It was a journal, bound in dark, almost black leather, its surface scarred and mottled like old bark. No title, no author. Just a clasp, corroded green with age, holding it shut. My breath hitched. This was it. The weight of it in my hands felt significant, almost preternatural. I carefully unlatched the clasp. The pages inside were thick, handmade paper, faintly yellowed, covered in a spidery, looping script. The entries weren't chronological, jumping erratically between dates, some decades apart. The language was archaic, flowery, but the underlying tone was one of growing desperation. The writer, whose name wasn't immediately apparent, described the manor, but not as a home. A misplaced key, a forgotten face, a word lost on the tongue. Then, it deepens. Names blur. Faces shift. The very ground beneath one's feet seems to alter. What was solid becomes mist. What was known becomes unknown. And the manor, it watches. It waits. It hungers. Another entry, much later, described a sickness of the mind, not of the body. But I know it is the house. It feeds. It grows strong on what we lose. My own memories, they are like sand through a sieve. Did I have a son? A daughter? The faces. They are gone. I swallowed, a dry rasp in my throat. The vague illusions, the sense of an active, malevolent presence. As I absorbed the disturbing words, a strange sensation washed over me. I blinked, my gaze drifting from the journal to the stacks of books around me. What was I looking for again? My mind felt suddenly, jarringly blank, like a slate wiped clean. It was right there, on the tip of my tongue, an important detail I'd spent hours tracking, but now gone. I frowned, rubbing a hand over my eyes. Stress, I told myself. Lack of sleep. The sheer volume of information I was trying to digest. It was natural to feel a bit overwhelmed. I'd been working nonstop, pushing myself to the limit to get the manor ready, to uncover its past. My determination was usually unwavering, a shield against fatigue. Nothing. The harder I tried, the more elusive it became. It was just a name, a small detail. But the journal's words echoed in my head, the forgetting begins subtly. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. Superstitious nonsense from a bygone era, written by someone clearly unwell. My focus returned to the journal, its morbid contents pulling me back in. I needed to transcribe these passages, to bring them back to the manor, to understand what I was up against. It was a utilitarian space, stripped of any warmth, designed for function over comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow on rows of metal shelves. The air, recycled and cool, carried the faint, metallic scent of old paper and disinfectant. I was grateful for the solitude, even if the environment felt more like an interrogation room than a place of study. I'd spent weeks trying to gain access, pulling every string I had, explaining the obscure nature of my research into the manor's forgotten lineage. The local records keeper had eventually relented, granting me this precious, limited time. My backpack, heavy with photocopies of the journal's more cryptic entries, lay beside me on the scarred oak table. I spread out my notes, the old pages brittle and yellowed, each word a step further into the manor's shadowed past. My initial searches had been frustratingly vague. The manor, or the old house on Blackwood Road as it was sometimes euphemistically called in older documents, rarely appeared in official records. When it did, it was often tied to brief, unsettling mentions. Property dispute, family of the deceased showing signs of acute melancholia. Unexplained abandonment, no forwarding address. There was a deliberate vagueness, a sense of omissions. It was as if a collective civic hand had tried to scrub the place clean from memory. I found a fragile newspaper clipping from 1898, tucked into a folder labeled Local Curiosities. The headline was sensational. The article itself was oddly muted, almost censored. Prominent landowner vanishes from estate. The accompanying text spoke of unforeseen circumstances and a complete absence of foul play, phrases that felt hollow and forced. It detailed the disappearance of a certain Mr. Elias Thorne, a recluse who had owned the manor generations ago. His servants had simply found the house empty one morning, his breakfast still on the table, a book open by the fireplace. Then there was a series of archived police reports from the 1930s, detailing a rash of what were termed mental breakdowns among the manor's short-term tenants. One report described a young woman found wandering the grounds, disoriented, repeating nonsensical phrases about the hum and the empty spaces. Another spoke of a man who, after only a month in residence, had begun to systematically destroy all mirrors in the house, claiming they showed him what wasn't there. Each account was a fragment, a piece of a puzzle I was desperate to solve. The more I read, the less coherent the picture became. I rubbed my temples, a dull ache throbbing behind my eyes. The words on the page seemed to swim, the black ink blurring into indistinct smudges. I blinked, focusing hard, but for a moment, the room around me seemed to tilt, the rows of shelves wavering like heat haze. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving me with a faint ringing in my ears and the unsettling feeling that something had just brushed past my awareness. I pushed the feeling down, attributing it to fatigue. I'd been working too hard, sleeping too little. My gaze drifted back to the journal photocopies, specifically the cryptic symbols I'd been trying to decipher. They were geometric, intricate, almost hypnotic. As I stared, the lines seemed to shift, to subtly rearrange themselves, forming patterns that my conscious mind couldn't quite grasp. Later that night, back in my temporary lodgings, the nightmares returned with a vengeance. I was in the manor, but it wasn't my manor. I woke with a gasp, drenched in sweat, the taste of ash in my mouth. The disorientation didn't dissipate with the dawn. I found myself staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, a stranger looking back. Not physically, not exactly, but the expression in the eyes, the slight slump of the shoulders, it wasn't entirely mine. I shook my head again, trying to dislodge the lingering tendrils of the dream. I made coffee, the familiar ritual a small anchor in the rising tide of unease. But as I poured the steaming liquid, my hand trembled, and a significant portion sloshed over the rim of the mug, scalding my fingers. I hissed, pulling my hand back, but then I stopped. Had I just picked up the mug with my left hand? I was right-handed, always had been. Throughout the day, these small, insidious moments accumulated. I'd walk into a room, a specific task in mind, only for the purpose to evaporate the moment I crossed the threshold. Conversations from the previous day felt hazy, their details indistinct. Had I really spoken to the clerk at the hardware store about that specific type of wood sealant, or was I confusing it with another memory? The fragmented accounts from the prison library had opened a door, but what was stepping through it wasn't just knowledge. I was Reed, the meticulous restorer, the man who prided himself on clarity and precision. Was I truly uncovering the manor's madness, or was I simply inheriting it? My footsteps, usually precise and confident, felt leaden on the polished concrete floor. I had come here for answers, for the forgotten details of the manor's past that I knew must exist somewhere in the public record. But now, standing amidst these silent archives, a different kind of silence began to press in. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a weight, an expectation. I moved down an aisle, my fingers trailing over the spines of books on local history, property deeds, and old town ledgers. Each title was a mundane record, a testament to verifiable facts. I needed facts. I needed solid ground. My vision blurred for a split second, a ripple across my perception, like heat haze distorting a distant road. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. Just fatigue, I told myself, the strain of too many sleepless nights spent sifting through the manor's secrets. Then, a whisper. But it came again, a sibilant murmur, like dry leaves skittering across stone. It wasn't a language I recognized, yet it felt intimately directed, a sound meant only for me. I stopped, head cocked, listening. The library was utterly still. No one else was here. I pulled out a thick, leather-bound volume titled Chronicles of the Northern Settlements. Volume 1 distinctly remembered placing this book back on a lower shelf, second from the left, after an earlier research session. Now, it was here, on a higher shelf, in a completely different section. A tremor ran through me. Had I simply misremembered? My memory, once a meticulous archive, felt suddenly porous, like a sieve. I opened the book. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, filled with dense, archaic script. As I scanned a paragraph, the words began to swim. Not just visually, but their meaning twisted. A sentence about a land grant shifted, becoming a cryptic reference to the feeding ground where identity may be shed. My eyes darted back, but the words were normal again, talking about crops and boundaries. This wasn't fatigue. This was a deliberate assault. I stumbled back, knocking against a metal shelf. The impact sent a shiver through the stack, and a cascade of books clattered to the floor. I didn't care. But as I turned, the aisles seemed to stretch interminably, the rows of shelves multiplying, curving into impossible angles. Panic tightened its grip. It was gone. Or rather, every wall looked like the same wall, every corner the same corner. The sterile order had devolved into a labyrinth designed to disorient. "Read," a voice murmured, impossibly close, right beside my ear. It was a voice I knew. My grandfather's. The man who had first taught me the delicate art of restoration, who had gifted me the very tools I now used. My grandfather was long dead. I spun around, but there was nothing there, just the unforgiving metal of the shelves. My identity. That was the target. The entity wasn't just twisting facts, it was twisting me. I pressed my hands against my temples, trying to anchor myself. My name is Reed. I am an antique restorer. I live in the manor. Then, a memory flashed, vivid and terrible. Not of the manor, but of my old workshop, years ago. I was hunched over a delicate porcelain doll, my hands poised, ready to repair a hairline crack. But in the memory, the doll's ceramic face was my own, cracked and distorted, and as I touched it, my reflection shattered into 1,000 pieces, each fragment showing a different, unfamiliar face. A stranger's face. I cried out, a strangled sound that dissolved into the eerie quiet. This wasn't just a memory, it was a fabrication, a surgical insertion into my own past. The entity wasn't just eroding, it was replacing. I closed my eyes, fighting for breath, fighting for clarity. When I opened them, the library was subtly different. The books weren't bound volumes, but loose, yellowed pages, fluttering on invisible currents of air, each one filled with a single, looping word, forgotten. Forgotten. The entity didn't just feed on memory, it became memory. It was a parasitic presence that replaced what was real with its own manufactured past, slowly consuming the host's identity until nothing remained but its own twisted imprint. It wasn't just trying to scare me, it was trying to unmake me. But the image was hazy, indistinct, like looking through frosted glass. I pressed my hand against the cool glass, desperate to feel something solid, something real. But the glass felt thin, insubstantial, almost like smoke. The entity was here, not as a physical presence, but as a corrosive force, slowly, meticulously, erasing Reed. And I didn't know how to stop it. That chilling realization, the one that had solidified into a cold, hard knot in my gut, left me no choice. The entity wasn't just a parasite, it was a shapeshifter, a mimic. It didn't just feed on memory, it became memory. I had to get out. Now. My fingers, surprisingly steady, fumbled with the screen. No signal. Not even a bar. I walked to the window, holding it up like a desperate offering to the heavens. Nothing. Just the endless, oppressive gray of the sky above the manor's overgrown grounds. The battery icon, a tiny, mocking sliver of green, suggested power wasn't the issue. The connection simply wasn't there. It was as if the very air around the manor absorbed all electromagnetic waves, leaving me stranded in a silent, dead zone. I tried the landline, a dusty, ornate contraption in the study that I hadn't touched since moving in. The dial tone was a flat, unyielding hum. No outgoing line. There was only one option left, physical escape. I strode through the echoing halls, the manor groaning around me as if in protest. I ignored it all, my focus a pinpoint on the heavy oak front door. This place wasn't just old, it was alive, and it wanted me. It wanted to consume me. But I was Reed, the meticulous restorer, the one who saw the cracks and filled them, who understood the architecture of decay. I would not be another forgotten casualty in its decaying walls. Each step down was a descent into something deeper, something I couldn't quite grasp. This wasn't the usual mustiness of an old house. It was different. More personal. It was the scent of a memory, perhaps one that wasn't even mine. I reached the bottom. My gaze fixed on the double doors. They looked solid, reassuringly real. Instead, a wave of stale, conditioned air hit me, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of aging paper and floor wax. Fluorescent lights hummed with an irritating, incessant drone. My eyes struggled to adjust, not to sunlight, but to the stark, artificial glow. I was standing in a narrow aisle, flanked by towering shelves of books. Not the dusty, leather-bound tomes of the manor, but cheap paperbacks and worn, utilitarian hardcovers. The walls were institutionally beige, the ceiling tiles stained. A low, muffled conversation drifted from somewhere further in, punctuated by the rustle of turning pages and the occasional muffled cough. My mind reeled. This wasn't the manor's foyer. I stood frozen, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. How? How could I have walked through that door and ended up here? It felt utterly real, the weight of the air, the specific, almost chemical smell of the cleaning products mixed with old paper. A cheap plastic clock on the far wall displayed 2:17 a.m. This wasn't a dream. It couldn't be. The entity wasn't just replacing my memories, it was creating my reality. It wasn't just eroding who I was, it was rewriting where I was. This library, with its dull lighting and endless, forgotten stories, was a cage. A mental construct. A manufactured delusion designed to ensnare me, to make me doubt everything I perceived. I took a shaky step forward, then another, trying to make sense of the rows of books. Titles blurred, meaningless words on faded spines. I needed to find an exit. I stumbled through the narrow aisles, the fluorescent hum a buzzing saw blade in my skull. There was a door at the far end, a heavy metal one with a small, reinforced window. I rushed towards it, my fingers fumbling for a handle that wasn't there. It was a solid, impenetrable slab. Panic clawed at my throat. I pounded on the door, the dull thud echoing eerily in the quiet space. "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice cracked, thin and reedy. The muffled conversation from earlier seemed to cease. No light, no sound. I spun around, desperate. The library, once merely disorienting, now felt actively hostile. Was this what the entity wanted? My eyes landed on a specific shelf, drawn by an invisible thread. A single book, its cover faded to a nondescript gray, seemed to pulse with a faint, internal light. I pulled it out. No title, no author. Just blank pages. As I stared, a single word began to bleed onto the first page, slowly, ink seeping from nowhere: forget. The word solidified, stark and black against the yellowed paper. My hands trembled, the book almost slipping from my grasp. This wasn't just a physical trap, it was a psychological assault. It was telling me to give up, to surrender my identity, my memories, to its insidious influence. I dropped the book, stumbling backward, tripping over my own feet. The shelves seemed to lean in, the books blurring into a single, suffocating wall of forgotten narratives. My breath came in ragged gasps. I was trapped. The world was no longer fixed, and I, Reed, was no longer certain of anything. The entity was not just replacing my past, it was destroying my present, one terrifying, fabricated reality at a time. Suddenly, the hum of the fluorescent lights flickered, died, then roared back to life, brighter, harsher. The sickly sweet scent intensified, choking me. My head swam. The beige walls of the library seemed to ripple, to melt, to flow. Then, just as abruptly, I was back. Standing in the manor's foyer, my hand still gripping the heavy oak door handle. The scent of old wood and damp stone filled my nostrils, replacing the sickly sweetness and stale paper. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling violently. I hadn't left the manor at all. And the entity had shown me, with terrifying clarity, just how easily it could build those hallways, and how impossible it would be to escape them. Fluorescent lights, buzzing with a barely perceptible whine, cast a sickly yellow glow over the rows of forgotten books, their spines cracked, their pages brittle. I was alone, truly alone, a privilege granted by a sympathetic, if weary, warden who saw the haunted look in my eyes and perhaps recognized a fellow traveler on the road to obsession. It wasn't a formal record, but a personal account, scrawled in a shaky hand from the late 1800s. I'd found it tucked away in a misfiled box, labeled only local miscellany, uncategorized. The prose was dense, archaic, but the chilling familiarity of its content had seized me days ago and hadn't let go. The writer, a reclusive scholar who had once lived near my manor, detailed a slow, insidious decline. Not of health, but of self. He wrote of the creeping void, the thief of recollection, an entity that didn't just steal memories, but reshape them. It does not merely take, one passage read, the ink faded to sepia, but replaces, weaving its own thread into the tapestry of what was. Until the original pattern is lost, and only the mimic remains. That was it. That was the knot that had been tightening in my gut. How many times had I questioned a memory, only to have it slide into place, slightly altered, yet undeniably mine? The manor's history was a labyrinth, but the scholar's journal had provided a crucial thread. He spoke of the old stone, a megalithic structure supposedly buried deep beneath the manor's foundations, predating even the first crude settlements. Not a building, but a geological anomaly, a focal point. He believed it was a focal point for something ancient, something that had always been there, merely dormant. My eyes scanned a faded blueprint of the manor's original construction, noting the curious, almost ritualistic placement of the load-bearing walls, all converging on a central point that, according to the scholar's notes, was directly above the old stone. It wasn't just a house built on a haunted spot, the house itself was a cage. Perhaps a conduit. The entity wasn't a ghost, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't a specter haunting halls. It was something far older, far more fundamental. It was a consciousness that had learned to feed on the very essence of human experience, memory, identity, the stories we tell ourselves to define who we are. It didn't want my house, it wanted me. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the far end of the library, the sound of an old wooden shelf groaning under unseen weight. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. Just the building settling, I told myself, but the rational explanation felt thin, translucent. I returned to the scholar's journal, flipping through pages near the end, where his handwriting grew increasingly erratic, almost frantic. He spoke of the final absorption, of witnesses who no longer remembered themselves, but lived out a borrowed life, smiling with unfamiliar eyes. This was the ultimate cost. Not just losing memories, but losing self. To become an empty vessel, animated by a foreign consciousness, living a lie that felt utterly, terrifyingly real. A perfect delusion. What did that mean? I traced the words with a trembling finger. The next paragraph was almost illegible, a desperate scrawl. To sever the link. A profound erasure. Not of what it seeks to take, but of what it cannot comprehend. A foundational truth, willingly surrendered. A memory so absolute, so defining, that its absence creates a chasm too vast for the mimic to bridge. My mind raced, connecting the dots. The entity thrived on identity, on the intricate web of memories that made me me. It was weaving itself into my past, making itself indispensable. But what if I could deny it a crucial thread? Not by fighting it, but by removing something it needed, something it couldn't replicate or understand? A foundational truth. A memory so absolute. What could that be? My name? My parents? My love for restoration, the very craft that had led me to the manor in the first place? It would be a sacrifice, not of blood, but of self. It wasn't just about escaping the manor. It was about escaping myself, or what was left of me. The entity didn't want to destroy me, it wanted to become me, leaving behind a smiling, empty shell, convinced of a life that was never its own. The sacrifice wasn't just theoretical, it was personal, agonizing, and perhaps, inevitable. My own mind, a labyrinth I'd once navigated with precision, was now a fractured landscape, shifting and blurring with each passing moment. My fingers, trembling, traced the archaic script in the brittle volume. The air was thick with the scent of aged paper and something else, something metallic and faint, like old blood, or perhaps just the ghost of the library's former occupants. I blinked, trying to clear the haze from my vision, but the words still swam, occasionally rearranging themselves into gibberish. I had to. This was my last chance, my only chance. It was like a constant, low-frequency vibration, shaking the very foundations of myself. I was losing myself, piece by agonizing piece. The text spoke of an ancient, desperate measure, not a weapon, but a sacrifice. It wasn't about destroying the entity, for it could not be destroyed, only contained. It fed on identity, on the unique tapestry of a self, weaving it into its own monstrous being. My mind. The idea, once a terrifying abstract, was solidifying into a horrifying reality. To contain it, I would have to become the container. I would have to strip away every defining memory, every unique experience, every nuance that made me read. Not forget them, no. But deliberately excise them, offering them up as a final, concentrated feast, a last, rich banquet before closing the doors to my own self, leaving nothing but an empty shell for the entity to starve in. The implication hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just my memories that would be gone. I would be a husk, a statue, a breathing, unthinking monument to a battle fought and lost, even in victory. The Reed who walked into that manor would cease to exist. A shiver ran down my spine, independent of the library's cool air. My hands felt numb, my fingers stiff as I turned another page. These were the ones who had attempted it before, the keepers, as the text called them. They hadn't died, not in the traditional sense. They had simply ceased to be themselves. But what choice did I have? To do nothing was to succumb, to become a puppet, my memories twisted and weaponized against others. That was a fate worse than any oblivion. I was already halfway gone. The entity had already taken so much. This plan, this terrible, beautiful plan, was a way to reclaim what little agency I had left, to make my own ending. The method, as described, was deceptively simple in principle, terrifying in execution. It required a complete severance from all external anchors, no possessions, no familiar sights, no sounds. It meant going back to the manor, to the very heart of its power, and entering a specific chamber. There, I would have to mentally reconstruct my entire identity, piece by piece, not to remember it, but to offer it, like a meticulously crafted decoy. And at the precise moment of its full manifestation, I would have to sever the connection, not just to the memory, but to the act of remembering, closing the door on my conscious mind forever. It was a final act of restoration, not of an antique, but of a broken world, by sacrificing the restorer. My gaze fell upon a faded inscription at the bottom of a page, scribbled in a different hand, far more recent than the rest. The hardest part, it read, is knowing when the self is truly gone. I closed the book, the thud echoing in the vast, empty room. The dust motes danced in the single beam of moonlight slicing through the tall window. I was a craftsman, and this was my final, most intricate, most painful project. I would build the cage, piece by piece, from the fragments of myself. And then, I would step inside. The air, usually stale, felt charged, thick with a silent hum that vibrated in my teeth. The truth, gleaned from dusty, brittle pages, sat heavy in my gut, a leaden stone. My own mind, a labyrinth I'd once navigated with certainty, was now the battleground. I sat at the long, scarred oak table, the single overhead fluorescent light buzzing like a trapped insect, casting harsh shadows that danced with every subtle shift of my breath. Around me, the towering shelves, packed tight with forgotten narratives and bureaucratic records, seemed to lean in, silent witnesses. My plan, born of desperation and the chilling insight from the forbidden texts, was simple in its concept, terrifying in its execution. I had to make myself known, make myself a target, and then, with every fiber of my being, fight for the very concept of read. The entity fed on the erosion of identity, the blurring of lines. So, I would remember. I would construct an unassailable fortress of self, brick by painstaking brick. I started with the simplest things. The scent of linseed oil and beeswax, the familiar tang of wood dust in my workshop. The precise weight of my grandfather's chisel in my hand, the cool, smooth feel of its aged wooden handle against my palm. I pictured the intricate grain of a mahogany desk I'd spent months restoring, tracing its whorls and knots in my mind's eye, a map of time and effort. A subtle shift. The buzzing of the fluorescent light intensified, morphing into a low, guttural growl that seemed to emanate from the very walls. My eyelids fluttered, but I kept them shut, clinging to the mahogany. Not actual sounds, but thoughts, insinuations, sliding into the quiet corners of my awareness. What is a chisel? A tool. Anyone could use it. Is that you? The voice was not a voice, but a feeling of doubt, a corrosive acid seeping into the carefully constructed image of my memory. I tightened my mental grip. It's my chisel, I affirmed, not aloud, but with a fierce internal conviction. My grandfather's. I saw the mahogany desk, but its surface was no longer smooth. It was warped, splintered, covered in a thick, black grime I'd never seen. The careful joinery I'd perfected was undone, gaping fissures appearing where I'd spent weeks on seamless restoration. You failed, the thoughts hissed, slithering into my mind. You never finished it. You left it to rot. You are not a restorer. You are a destroyer. Panic flared, a hot, choking sensation in my chest. This was it. The attack. It wasn't just distorting the memory, it was attempting to rewrite my history, to undermine the very foundation of my craft, my passion. If I wasn't a restorer, then who was I? I forced myself to breathe, a slow, deliberate intake of the stale library air. No, I thought, fiercely. That's not right. I focused on the feeling of the finished wood beneath my fingertips, the subtle sheen of the French polish, the pride of a job meticulously done. I remembered the exact angle of the light falling across the desk that afternoon, the faint scent of lemon oil. The entity shifted tactics. The mahogany desk flickered, replaced by another scene. I was younger, standing in a familiar kitchen, a warm, comforting smell of baking bread in the air. A woman's hand, soft and familiar, rested on my shoulder. My mother. A wave of warmth, of genuine affection, washed over me. This was a core memory, a safe harbor. But then, the details began to fray. Her face blurred, her features indistinct. She resented you. A burden. A mistake. My breath hitched. No. This was a lie. I remembered her laughter, the way she tucked my hair behind my ear, the stories she'd read. I remembered the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled. I fought to bring her face into focus, to recall the specific shade of her blue dress, the pattern on her apron. But the entity was relentless. The voice intensified, a chorus of jeering, formless thoughts. You are alone. You have always been alone. No one cares. No one remembers you. You are nothing. My identity was unraveling, thread by painful thread. Reed. What was Reed, without his memories, without his past, without the people who shaped him? I felt the edges of my consciousness blurring, a terrifying sensation of being stretched thin, transparent, on the verge of simply ceasing to be. But deep within me, a stubborn ember still glowed. The meticulousness. The focus. The refusal to let something decay completely. I was a restorer. I did not give up on broken things. I did not give up on myself. I didn't try to force the memories back into their perfect form, because the entity would only twist them again. Instead, I focused on the feeling of being Reed. The specific ache in my lower back after a long day in the workshop. The particular way my coffee tasted in the morning. The quiet satisfaction of seeing a damaged object regain its former glory. These were not memories to be distorted, they were sensations, experiences, deeply ingrained in my present. The library around me seemed to shudder. I opened my eyes. The library was still there, the shelves still packed, the lights still buzzing, albeit erratically. But the air was thick, heavy, vibrating with a palpable malevolence. I felt drained, as if I'd run a marathon, every muscle screaming in protest, but I was still here. My name, Reed, resonated in my mind, a solid, undeniable anchor. I was battered, my internal landscape scarred, but I was still me. The battle had been brutal, and I had endured, for now. I knew my name was Reed. The guards called me that. The paperwork, when it was presented, had that name printed starkly. But beyond the 4 letters, the identity felt thin, stretched. It was like looking at an antique piece, perfectly restored, but knowing deep down that some crucial, irreplaceable component was missing, forever lost to time and decay. The entity. I had faced it. I had won, I supposed. The oppressive weight, the insidious whispers that had burrowed into my mind, they were gone. The gnawing hunger for my memories, for the very essence of who I was, had receded. What remained was a vast, echoing emptiness where my past should have been. A landscape scoured clean by a destructive force. I remembered a flash. Not of light, but of pure, annihilating sound. A roar that wasn't heard with ears but felt in the marrow of my bones, a vibration that threatened to shake me apart. Then, a collapse. A feeling of falling, of something immense giving way, and then this. What had I done? How had I stopped it? The specifics eluded me, shimmering just beyond reach like heat haze on a summer road. I knew there had been a struggle, a desperate, final push. I knew I had fought for my mind, for the very concept of Reed. And I had survived. My gaze drifted over the rows of books. History, philosophy, fiction, self-help. Each spine a promise of knowledge, of stories, of lives lived. I reached out and pulled a dusty volume on European architecture. My fingers brushed over the intricate line drawings of cornices and pilasters. A faint warmth, a ghost of recognition, stirred within me. Reed, the meticulous antique restorer. That much I knew, or at least, I had been told. I could still appreciate the precision of the lines, the balance of the forms. But the passion, the deep, abiding love for the craft, that was a dull ember now, barely glowing. It was a skill without its context, a tool without a purpose. I flipped through the pages, seeing the intricate details, the dedication of the architect. I tried to recall my own work, the feel of a delicate brush in my hand, the satisfying scrape of a careful chisel, the rich scent of aged wood and polish. Nothing. A vast, smooth wall met every attempt. Faces, colleagues, a friendly face from the local hardware store, a past lover, they were all indistinct blurs, outlines without features. Names evaporated before I could grasp them. My childhood home, the sound of a parent's voice, a favorite meal, gone. The entity hadn't just taken memories, it had taken the emotional resonance of those memories, the very anchors of my identity. I was a ship adrift, its logbooks burned, its crew scattered, its destination forgotten. I knew I was Reed, but what did that mean, truly? What was Reed without his history, without his connections, without the experiences that had shaped him into the man who once meticulously restored antiques? I was determined, yes, to understand the scope of the damage, to map the empty spaces within my mind. It was a grim, painful task, but it was the only task left to me. I picked up another book, this one a collection of poetry. I read a line, then another, the words forming a coherent sentence, but their meaning, their emotional weight, felt distant, academic. It was like reading a language I understood intellectually but could not feel in my heart. Every moment I spent trying to remember was a fresh confrontation with the emptiness. Every flicker of a half-formed image, quickly extinguished, was a small death. The entity was gone. But it had left me here, a husk inhabited by a fading echo of a name. I was Reed, the man who had fought a war for his mind and won only the right to live within its devastating aftermath. I was here, in the quiet hum of the prison library, trying to learn who I was from books I couldn't truly comprehend, waiting for a past that would never return. The air here was thin, scrubbed clean of scent, unlike the manor's rich, earthy perfume of decay and damp stone. Here, it was all polished linoleum and the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant. I sat at a long, empty table, a stack of historical texts before me, none of which I'd actually opened. My fingers traced the smooth, cool surface of the tabletop. This was my attempt at rebuilding. Reclaiming. But the facts felt like sand slipping through my grasp. The interrogation, the trial, the conviction, it had all been a blur of shouted questions and cold, accusing gazes. They called it arson, manslaughter. They talked about the charred remains, the missing persons, the inexplicable gaps in my own testimony, but I knew. I knew what I had faced. I knew what I had done. I had won. That was the truth I clung to, the bedrock beneath the shifting sands. I remembered the final confrontation, or at least, what I believed to be the final confrontation. The entity, a formless hunger, had been everywhere and nowhere, a whisper in the timbers, a chill in the very air. It had tried to hollow me out, to make me a vessel for its endless consumption, to erase Reed and leave only a conduit for its ancient appetite. I had refused its banquet of memories. My plan, born of desperation and the slivers of clarity I could still grasp, had been simple, deny it sustenance. To remember nothing, to be nothing, was to starve it. I had wandered the manor's labyrinthine corridors, torch in hand, not to burn the place down, but to burn away the memories, the history, the very essence that fed the thing. Each flickering flame, each lick of heat against the ancient wood, had been a conscious act of forgetting. I didn't just destroy the house, I destroyed its narrative, its past, its connection to my own. I had become a blank slate, a wall against its insidious tendrils. Or so I told myself. The guards, the investigators, the lawyers, they saw a broken man, delusional and dangerous. I saw a survivor. I saw someone who had faced an unnameable horror and, through sheer force of will, had driven it back. I had cut myself free, severed the parasitic link. The manor, I assumed, was a husk, its power diminished, its hunger unfed. I was here, in this sterile box, a consequence of my actions, yes, but free from the true prison of the manor's influence. Or so I believed. Not words, not quite, but a resonance, like the memory of a voice, a thought brushing against the inside of my skull. Different. Smoother. Less textured. Like old photographs worn flat by too much handling. I'd catch myself staring at the other inmates, the guards, the rare visitor. Not with curiosity, but with a strange, almost clinical interest. I'd find myself observing their gestures, the nuances of their expressions, the way their eyes held fleeting emotions. And then, a peculiar sensation would wash over me, a faint echo. A resonance of their experience. A flicker of anger from the large man across the room, a pang of regret from the young woman at the next table, a dull ache of boredom from the guard pacing the perimeter. It was like I was tasting their internal landscape, a fleeting, almost imperceptible communion. But the feeling grew more pronounced, more frequent. And with each faint echo, a tiny piece of my own self seemed to soften, to blur. The memories I had fought so hard to keep distinct, the smell of my mother's baking, the feel of my father's rough hands, the intricate details of a favorite antique piece I'd restored, they were still there, yes, but they felt universal. Less mine. I picked up one of the untouched books, a heavy tome on local history. My reflection stared back at me in the polished cover. My face was thinner, etched with lines I hadn't known I possessed. My eyes, though, were the most unsettling. They held a depth that wasn't exhaustion, not sadness, but something vast and empty. A quiet hunger. Then it clicked. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow, insidious seep of understanding. The entity didn't need the manor. It didn't need a place. It needed a source. A collector. My victory hadn't been an escape. It had been a transformation. I hadn't starved it, I had merely changed its diet. It was no longer bound to a decaying house, siphoning the memories of its inhabitants, one by one. Now, it was free, residing within me, and through me, it could taste the world. Every fleeting thought, every buried regret, every joyful recollection from every soul I encountered, it was all a banquet, endlessly renewed. My identity hadn't been eroded, it had been expanded, stretched thin over an ever-growing consumption. I was the old woman who missed her garden, the young man who yearned for freedom, the guard who dreamed of his family. I opened my eyes and looked at my reflection again, truly looked. The hunger in those eyes wasn't just mine anymore. It was ancient, vast, and utterly insatiable. I had one, yes. But the prize was the knowledge that I was no longer just myself. I was the prison. And I was the library. And I was every story within it, waiting to be consumed. The entity hadn't been defeated. It had simply found a new, more efficient way to exist. And I was its host, its vessel, its twisted, victorious, eternal memory.